This is episode 475 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation of Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to join this week with Preston Cooper. He is the author of a new report called Ranking the 50 State Public University Systems on Price and Outcomes. And you work for a organization called FREOPP. I'm trying to figure out exactly, is the Center for Freedom and Opportunity, Preston?
Yeah, we're the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, and we're a nonpartisan think tank dedicated to expanding economic opportunity.
Right. Yeah, the organization's a little bit coy. They are FREOPP.org. Which is front and center there. But welcome, regardless, to Tipping Point, New Mexico. I look forward to having a fascinating conversation with you. Before we get started about your report itself and higher education return on investments thereof, talk a little bit about yourself and the organization, which I butchered the name of in the intro.
Sure. Well, so I'm Preston Cooper, and I'm a senior fellow in higher education policy at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, or FREOPP. We're big on acronyms. And as I mentioned, I do a lot of research into higher education policy, specifically what is the financial return to college? That is a question that's at the top of a lot of people's minds. Is college worth it? And what my research shows is that college is sometimes worth it. If you choose the right school, if you choose the right major, you can get a great return on your investment in time and money for education. But if you choose some programs out there, some schools out there are not going to get you a great return, and they might end up you might end up with a debt that you cannot repay. So that's what I'm all about, is trying to help people make those decisions to maximize the value of their education.
So two questions about that. How did you get involved in this particular issue? And is this a center of what your organization does, or describe kind of more broadly what the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity does?
Yes, absolutely. So the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity is dedicated to expanding economic opportunity to those who least have it. And so we have scholars working on a number of different issues. I do higher education, but we have folks working on K-12 education, the cost of housing, the cost of healthcare, the cost of energy. Basically, if there's something that's hitting your pocketbook, we probably have a scholar working on it. We're dedicated to trying and figuring out policy solutions, market-based solutions to lower the costs of the products that everyday Americans use, and trying to make sure that that those dollars that are in your wallet can stretch farther, and that living standards as a result will go up. As for me, how I got into this issue of what is of college ROI and the return to college, I look around at colleges and universities these days, which can be charging tens of thousands of dollars per year in tuition. I look at student loan debt, and that how that has become such a big political flashpoint, such a big issue. And I think about, why is this the case? Why are colleges able to get away with charging so much when it's not always worth it? And why are people having trouble paying back their loans, even though everyone's always told that a college degree is a great investment? And so I looked into the issue more. I wrote a few reports on the topic of what exactly is the return to college. And I tried to figure out, when is college going to pay off for students? When is that investment going to pay off such that you can pay back your loans, get a good middle-class job, and have enough income to raise a family? And when does education go wrong? And when does it mire you in debt that you might not be able to repay?
Now, I would expect that one of the more challenging aspects of coming up with a study is to just digest what ROI means from college, because certainly, the ideal, if you will, from a lot of college majors is just that you become a more well-rounded person, and that you understands the ideas of freedom and constitutional republicanism, et cetera, et cetera. And the liberal degree, if you will. Obviously, that's hard to put a real number on in terms of dollars and cents. But what do you consider, and what kind of just realistically has to be left a little bit by the side in terms of this report?
That's a great question. So, first of all, I want to stipulate that, financial returns are not the only reason people go to college, but they are an important one. And I believe that all degrees out there should be held to the very simple standard of, is this degree not going to make you any financially worse off? It doesn't have to make you rich, but at the very minimum, the degree should not leave you in a worse financial position than when you started college. And so my report attempts to answer that question by coming up with a measure called return on investment. And what return on investment is we basically look at what is the lifetime earnings that you can expect to get with a particular degree. So if you add up all of your earnings over your entire career with that degree, what are you going to earn? And then we compare that to what would you have earned if you had not gotten the college degree. And we take the difference between two numbers. We estimate that as the increase in lifetime earnings that you can expect from a particular degree. And then from that increase in earnings, we subtract the costs of college. So we subtract the cost that you're going to pay in tuition, what you're going to spend on books and supplies, and also the earnings that you're not going to be getting while you're spending your 4 years or more in college to earn your degree. And basically, once we have all those calculations set, we can subtract the cost of college from that increase in lifetime earnings, and we can determine, is college making you better off or not? And for about 28% of programs, the answer is no, that college is not making you financially better off. For 72%, they are meeting that very simple test, that college is actually leaving you in a better financial position than when you started. But 28% is still a very big number, and that there's still a lot of people going to college who are not necessarily getting a financial return from it.
Yeah, and unfortunately, from the sounds or from reading your report, New Mexico is one of the states that most lags in terms of return on investment, and that's unfortunate. I guess as a way to kind of dive into the report itself, talk about New Mexico, since that's the state we're in here, at least I'm in, and what specifically states that have high ROIs do, and what states that have low ROIs do incorrectly, if you will.
Yes, so I'm very sorry to be the bearer of bad news for your listeners, but I'm afraid that New Mexico doesn't do terribly well in our calculations of ROI. So as I mentioned, nationwide, about 28% of programs do not have a financial return. In New Mexico, that shares about 43%. So if you go to a college in New Mexico, it's more likely than it is at the national level that your degree is not going to pay off. And so we should be asking ourselves, what are the reasons for that? Why do some states do so much better on this ROI metric than other states? And it really comes down to what kind of programs are the universities offering. So if we look at states that are doing very well on the ROI calculation, these are places like South Dakota, Iowa, Kansas, Minnesota. These states tend to have a very well-developed system of technical colleges, trade schools, vocational institutions that are providing training in fields like licensed practical nursing, or say vehicle maintenance and repair, precision metalworking, welding, trades that are going to provide you with skills that are very in demand in the labor market. And because they have this very well-developed system of technical colleges, their ROI tends to be very, very high on average. But not every state, has that as an asset. And in some states, if you have four-year universities which are offering degrees in fields that don't pay off as well, such as dance, music, even psychology, then it's much more likely that the state is going to perform worse on our ROI calculation. And that is something we see in New Mexico, that there tends to be more of those degrees that don't pay off so well for students.
Now, I'm going to spitball here or gently try to poke holes in your findings. in terms of the report, or at least provide maybe additional data. New Mexico, you may not, have you ever really considered New Mexico or studied it, or kind of looked at it from a economic and social perspective? I want to clarify that first.
Yes, well, we are kind of taking a national perspective with this study. So we're not doing an in-depth examination of every state, but we're calculating ROI for every program out there, dividing them up by states and seeing which states come out the best.
Okay. Yeah. No, I'm not overall questioning your results. You'll see where I'm going here in a second, which is New Mexico has a relatively weak economy. We have some of the highest poverty rates, very heavily reliant on combination of federal spending, national labs, and the like, as well as the oil and gas industry. Those are really our biggest things going on economically. And I would expect that, because so many people who do go to college wind up staying in the state that they are from, the overall economic strength of the state would have a disproportionate impact in the data. How do you deal with that kind of issue? And I'm not saying it makes what you're saying wrong. It just means that because of New Mexico's poor economy, it might impact ROI for students.
Of course, that's an excellent question and a point we definitely want to talk about. So, the study is pretty agnostic as to the reasons for why ROI is higher or lower at particular places. It just looks at what is the case. So, if it happens to be the case that a college is located in an area where there are not a whole lot of job opportunities, then the earnings that people receive are going to be lower. But we try to address this in some capacity by also considering what that counterfactual is. And the counterfactual earnings, that's what would you have earned if you had not gone to college. That basically forms part of the ROI calculation. So if a college is in an area with a more depressed economy, we would expect that to both depress the wages of college graduates and non-college graduates. So all else being equal, that shouldn't affect ROI too much. Now, this gets complicated a little bit if, say, there are more opportunities around there for people who do not have a college education, if that pushes up the wages of non-college graduates relative to college graduates. So in states that, have big resource extraction industries, where there are a fair amount of jobs available to people who don't have a 4-year college education, that is something that can lower ROI. And that's because there are those jobs available that do pay a decent wage for people who are not going to college. And that is something that prospective students definitely need to consider. Should I be spending 4 years in college to get a degree, or should I be taking a job that does not require a college degree right now? And that's something that our ROI calculation can help people sort of make sense of.
So yeah, New Mexico, I guess, a lot of oil and gas jobs, a lot of them not necessarily technical, although the oil and gas industry has become much more, kind of IT and technical in nature. So it is changing. But on the other hand, we have just at one time, and I don't know how often they update this data, random trivia, but New Mexico had the most PhDs per capita of any state in the country, while also having a relatively poor and poorly educated citizenry because of the presence of both Los Alamos and Sandia National Labs. So there are definitely some high-paying jobs associated with those facilities if you have good technical backgrounds. Mm-hmm. So on the flip side, and talking about more of the general education system and its input. So a lot of concerns have been raised by my organization and others about the need for remedial education in higher education, because the K-12 system isn't getting the job done. How does the kind of the impact of higher edu or K-12 systems. How do you think that impacts your findings there?
That's a wonderful question. So one of the factors in our calculations is how long does it actually take you to earn the degree. So, you know, if you typical bachelor's degree time should be 4 years, but we know that doesn't always happen. Sometimes it takes 5 years to get that degree. Sometimes it takes 6 years, and sometimes people don't get the degree at all. And so when we're calculating ROI, we're trying to kind of incorporate the differential time to degree at different schools. You know, if you're at a school where a lot of people are taking more than 4 years to earn that bachelor's degree, you know, spending more time out of the labor force, maybe paying more in tuition as well, that's something that our calculation takes into account. And so if you have a high level of a remedial education at a particular university, that can be something that is affecting time to degree. If people are in all remedial classes their first year and they can't start taking those core classes until their second year, that might make it more likely that they're going to have to go to a fifth or sixth year. And it might make it more likely that they're going to drop out without finishing a degree at all. And so if we want to try and improve the aggregate return on investment for our higher education system, as you mentioned, a great place to start is the K-12 system, and trying to strengthen that in order to make sure that students are coming into college with the skills that they do need to be successful, so that they don't necessarily have to take those remedial courses. They can get their degrees faster, they can get out into the labor force faster, and they don't have to pay as much tuition. That is a great way to try and improve the value of college in the aggregate.
Very good. Yeah, that's something that we've certainly emphasized, and I've got more to talk about in terms of expanding college, but as a way of beginning that particular conversation, I want to clarify, most of the data I see in your report is from 2016 from the U.S. Census Bureau. Is that where the kind of snapshot in time is here in terms of the data?
Yes, so we're using a cohort of students that graduated between 2015 and 2017, and we're measuring their earnings in 2017, 2018, and 2019. So this is the data is a few years old. That's just the realities of dealing with government data. They don't move very fast, but that's the time period we're working with. It's generally pre-pandemic.
And that's totally fair and reasonable, and I empathize with you in terms of getting timely information. A lot of the reports that we have, are based on data that's a few years old. And the reason I really ask is obviously COVID is there, but on the other hand, and you may or may not know this, New Mexico, under our current governor, recently embarked upon what they are calling, you can look at the air parentheses or air quotes, free college here in New Mexico. And this is, we're talking taking effect in 2022. I don't know how tuition prices play into your discussion, and maybe if there's a broader theme there, you can highlight it. Obviously, for the students, the ROI has to be bigger if the tuition is bigger, but the difference between the student-specific ROI and the broader economic ROI is something I guess we should flesh out as well. But New Mexico's embraced free college very recently. How does that factor into, or how do you see that factoring into the data and the ROI writ large?
Yeah, so I want to caveat at first that this is a very recent development, so this is not reflected
Correct,
in
right?
that we produced. But one aspect of our report is that we do produce different measures of ROI depending on what kind of issue you care about. So if you're a student and you're looking to maximize the economic potential of your degree, you're going to want to know, what are you going to pay? What kind of tuition are you going to pay out of pocket when you're attending this college? But if you're somebody like the State Free Market Think Tank in New Mexico, or just an interested observer, a good citizen, then you might want to know, what is the total ROI for taxpayers? So if we look at what is the institution actually spending, not just what are students paying, but what is the institution actually spending on this education, and we can also calculate ROI with respect to that number to determine not just if the student is getting a financial return, but also is all of society getting a financial return if you consider the full investment. And so what we find is that because almost every college is going to give students some kind of a subsidy, whether that's through state appropriations, taxpayer financed appropriations, or just donations or some other third-party source of funding, it means that the ROI from that kind of broader social taxpayer perspective is always going to be less than the ROI from the student's perspective. And so that is going to be the case in New Mexico as well. So that if you look at ROI with respect to the total underlying spending, then it is going to be less than the ROI with respect solely to the tuition that the student is paying. So if you're a policymaker, that is something you definitely want to be thinking about as you're deciding, what sorts of colleges should we be funding and how should we be funding them?
Yeah, it would seem that having a price mechanism in the mix there would do a lot to ensure that people who as we got out of the way at the beginning, college isn't just all about money, but you don't want to go into a college degree that's not going to make back what you invest in it in terms of your time and ultimately getting a good paying job. So using that as a preface, it would seem that having a bit of a price in there beyond just time spent would be beneficial for driving the ROI higher, whereas free college and the like is going to drive the overall ROI lower. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And so if you look at European countries that have either free college or very, very low, heavily subsidized tuition, like let's take France, for example, you'll sometimes see, people are going to college for 5 or 6 years to get what should be a 4-year degree. And you've got these overcrowded lecture halls, people kind of spilling out the doors because, there's so many people who want to go to take advantage of the free college that the lectures, can't possibly accommodate them all. So, I look at places like that and I do agree that, yeah, I think that the students should have some buy-in there, that I think that a little bit of a price mechanism will make the students stop and think, is college really right for me? Is this something that I really think is going to benefit me versus, making it free for all will, I think, attract just everybody to go, whether that school is right for them or not. And you might end up with a scenario where students are not paying anything for college, but they're also not getting a whole lot out of their college education. And so that's why I would agree that I would worry about just a blanket free tuition policy for everybody.
Now, one of the things that I think obviously makes sense and it dovetails into this conversation a little bit is 2-year versus 4-year degrees. Did you look at the more vocational technical learning degrees at the 2-year level versus the broader 4-year degree?
Yes, we did. So we conducted 2 analyses, one for bachelor's degrees and one for those 2-year degrees and certificates. And, the findings kind of had a similar theme for both analyses, which is that your field of study is really what matters the most. So for bachelor's degrees, if you major in engineering, computer science, economics, business, nursing, you're probably going to get a pretty good return. If you major in psychology, arts, music, dance, probably not. And it's the same exact thing at the 2-year level. So if you get an associate's degree or a certificate in a field like licensed practical nursing or metalworking, welding, or vehicle repair, some of these more vocationally oriented fields of study, your investment in your education is almost certainly going to pay off. But if you get a degree in a field that at the 2-year level, which is has less of a labor market demand out there, such as the liberal arts, English literature, even cosmetology, barbering, hairstyling, that is going to be less likely to pay off. And sometimes very few of those programs are going to pay off at all. So at both the 2-year level and the 4-year level, it's really going to matter what your field of study is.
So there wasn't like a big broad trend that 2-year degrees were more, financially viable, higher ROI than 4-year degrees.
Yeah, so I mean, it really depends on the field of study. So, there's some 2-year
Okay.
degrees out there that are going to be just as good as, if not better than, a bachelor's degree. And for a lot of students, that's going to be the best option. But there are a lot of 2 years degrees out there which don't do so well. And so it's the exact same for the 4-year degree. It really depends on what you're choosing to study, what program you're choosing to pursue. That's really what matters the most to determine whether you're going to get a financial payoff or not.
Fair enough. Yeah. And you go into, I mean, I can't recommend highly enough, first and foremost, your report. It's really excellent. FREOPP.org, ranking the 50 state public university systems on price outcomes. It really is fascinating, especially if you have a young person who's looking at college, and maybe you as a parent are potentially subsidizing a part of that college diploma. It's fascinating reading. But one of the really unique and I think very useful things is towards the end of your report, most valuable program by state. So you go through all the 50 states. And I think the interesting thing for somebody just looking at different majors and whatnot is that nursing, right here in New Mexico, for example, University of New Mexico, main campus, bachelor's degree in nursing, in various fields within that are the best ROI programs. But nursing is a strong performer across the country. And I'm not expecting you to answer these questions, but it seems like either nurses are maybe better paid than we give them credit for, or there really is such a dire need for nurses that going to college and getting a nursing degree it looks like half the states that are thereabouts is the best single ROI on your college dollar.
Yeah, that's a great point. So in that analysis that you're referring to, basically what we did is we determined what is the most valuable program in each state. And what we did was we multiplied the ROI of that program by the number of students who graduate from it to come up with a measure of, here's the total economic value that this program is producing. And in more than half of states, that most valuable program is a nursing program. And that's because there is this huge demand for nurses right now. I mean, we've got an aging population. We've got a lot of demand for healthcare. That is a profession that is growing, and that is a profession where a lot of people can make a pretty decent living. If they're able to get through school. I think one issue is that a lot of nursing schools are even turning away qualified applicants. I think about 80,000 qualified applicants for nursing schools were turned away in 2019. So that which just goes to show you, what a huge demand there is for people with this sort of training. And I want to, come back to the most valuable program issue really quickly, because, when we're talking about just college broadly, often, people will think of Ivy League schools or very highly selective nonprofit colleges, and it's true that a lot of those do very well on the ROI ranking, but they're so tiny. They brag about their 4 or 5% acceptance rates and how many students they reject, which is, I think, kind of pretty perverse. And it turns out that if you want a measure of what is the full economic value that a school is creating, measuring not just the ROI per student, but the ROI in the aggregate, multiplied by the number of students that they're educating, it turns out that it's a lot of less selective public 4-year colleges that are offering programs in nursing, engineering, and business, very valuable in-demand programs that tend to do the best, that tend to produce the most economic value for society.
Yeah, and if you kind of scroll over that information here for New Mexico, there's a 429 student count, which I don't know, that's not a huge number, obviously, when you're looking at a state even as small as New Mexico. And that's at UNM only, though. But the ROI is 489,000, close to 490,000, which is pretty darn good, and compares favorably with a lot of majors in a lot of other states. So definitely some opportunities out there for young people, even in New Mexico, which has an overall low score.
Mm. Yeah, I would agree, and I would suggest to the state legislature, if they're listening, that rather than investing taxpayer dollars in trying to make college free for everybody, I would try to identify some of those high performing programs where there's a lot of labor market demand, and use that investment instead to try and expand them so that they can serve more students, even if those students are paying some tuition.
Yeah, and that was what I was going to ask you about next, is how do you, or what do you encourage policymakers to do? Obviously, creating more opportunities in some of these high ROI fields would seem to be a very viable option. Obviously, enacting Rio Grande Foundation's public policy reforms to build economic strength and diversity would be another. But what are some of the other things that you would recommend that policymakers consider? You think they should just roll up the gender studies department or some of these other programs?
Well, I would argue that we should give colleges themselves the incentives to figure out what programs are producing the most economic value for students, and work to expand those. One great example from your neighbors in Texas is a community college called Texas State Technical College. And the deal there is that the state legislature funds them entirely based on what their graduates earn. So they just look into their unemployment records. They see what are graduates of Texas State Technical College making, and then they fund the college as a small percentage of those earnings that their graduates are making. And this creates a direct alignment of incentives between the school and the students. So the school will say, hey, if we want to get more funding, we're going to have to make sure we're delivering for students. We're going to have to make sure that we are giving them education in fields where there is a lot of labor market demand. And we're going to have to scale up programs that are serving students well, and maybe scale down some programs that are not serving students quite as well with respect to their future earnings. And that's a very successful model. They've seen a huge increase in the number of students they're serving, a huge increase in the earnings that those students are getting after graduation. And I think that it's something that should be replicated elsewhere. More states should figure out ways to make sure that the incentives their colleges are facing are aligned with their students' best interests.
Yeah, that's good stuff. And the final chart in your paper. Now, maybe this is the one that includes state funding and ranks all the states based on tuition and state funding, correct? This is the
That's
one that
correct.
has the most holistic, which, as a free market guy, likes to look at the overall impact. I mean, I get it. If you're a college kid, you might look upward in the chart for what the ROI is for you personally, but policymaker wise, I think it's important to look at the overall outcome. And you mentioned Texas, they're close to 200,000 ROI per student. New Mexico's under $50,000. So we're talking quadruple, which is amazing. But looking at those specific, that particular chart and that kind of outcome, Virginia, Iowa, and to an extent Michigan are the states that really stand out as having strong ROIs. What do they do successfully? Because those are pretty diverse states. There's not a lot of what I would call similarities between Virginia, Iowa, and Michigan.
Yeah, so what those states are doing is, I think it really goes back to what kinds of programs are they offering. You've got University of Virginia, University of Michigan. Those are both fairly prestigious selective public schools, but they're also pretty big, and they kind of play a leading role in increasing ROI across the entire university system. Iowa is another great example. So you've got Iowa State University there, which has one of the premier engineering departments in the country. Their students there are routinely getting over $1 million ROI from an engineering degree, as we pointed out in another paper. So it really comes down to what kinds of programs are your schools offering? And what kinds of economic value are they producing for students? And that is going to be correlated, that return for the entire state, the return for taxpayers is going to be correlated with return for students because of that factor, which is what are students studying, and is that what they're studying going to be something that's going to get them a well-paying job?
Yeah, looking at Michigan and going up one chart, the most valuable program by state, graduates of University of Michigan at Ann Arbor with a bachelor's degree in computer and informational sciences have an ROI in excess of $2 million. That's an ROI that you want to have. Is there something really unique about you? I'm not familiar, being a poli-sci grad myself, computer and information sciences. Is this a well-known and particularly challenging program? And you don't think of Michigan as exactly, it's not Silicon Valley over there.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not too familiar with the details of that program, but computer science is it's a degree that pays very well across the board, but we do see that there are certain programs that are just real standouts. And it's possible that there is something unique that those programs are doing, which is giving their graduates a leg up over all the other computer science graduates out there. Maybe maybe they have a guy at Google who likes to hire all of the University of Michigan graduates. Who knows? But or maybe it is something special that they're doing. But there are some programs out there that just seem to be real standouts.
Yeah, and I'm kind of surprised not to see New Mexico Tech on the list for New Mexico, because New Mexico Tech is widely considered to be one of the best engineering schools in the country. I noticed that your most valuable programs at 86 is the Colorado School of Mines, which is in many ways shares a lot of similarities. Petroleum engineering at School of Mines. New Mexico Tech is a school with a lot of similarities to that one, but
I just looked them up in our database, and they do extremely well. So, that petroleum engineering degree is worth about $1.6 million, according to our ROI calculation. So it just must be that they have a smaller enrollment than the nursing school at UNM, but that doesn't mean that they're not also an excellent institution providing a lot of value for students.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's a lot of complexity here, and I really admire the way you compiled everything and create what I think is a very accessible set of data and information in these maps and whatnot. So we're about at the end of what we need to talk about. Anything that I missed or anything you want to put out there that we haven't really hit on during this conversation?
Yeah, I think I would just reiterate one more time that, a lot of guidance counselors and a lot of adults out there are telling students, go to college, just go to college no matter what. That's the only path to the middle class. And I would say you have to remember it's more complicated than that. Yes, college can be a great option, but you have to be deliberate about what kind of program, what kind of school you're choosing. And you also have to remember that there are also a lot of great options out there that are not a traditional four-year college degree. There's trade schools, there's apprenticeships. There are many different pathways towards economic mobility, and I would encourage you to give due consideration to all of them.
Well, Preston Cooper, thank you very much. And again, the website is FREOPP.org, FREOPP.org. And it's great information, and it's very detailed. And again, it is the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, a nonprofit think tank focused on expanding economic opportunity to those who least have it. So thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.